You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, Will.
Hello, David.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to episode 221 of the Common Descent Podcast. It is Snake Month.
Snake Month.
Here at Common Descent, July is Snake Month, and we are celebrating this episode by talking about snakes and other snake-like things. This episode's topic is legless lizards, which is an enormous topic. We are going to talk about the overall trend of lizards becoming snake-like in their body shape and in some ways in their behavior.
Yeah.
We will go over the vast living diversity of legless lizards. We'll talk about how they vary, how they live their lives, and we'll talk about what is known about the evolution and deep history of this trend of lizards becoming snake-like. We will also talk a bunch about snakes. It's going to be good. This is a very fitting Snake Month topic that I'm excited about.
Yeah, no, definitely, because this is a group that doesn't get many other chances to be talked about. So,
yes.
Excited to dive into them.
Also excited about this episode are probably the people who requested this topic. Every episode of the podcast is a requested topic by our listeners. This topic was requested by Lucy, Ben, Tanner, Barbara, Ollie, and Valeria.
Good requests. Excellent for Snake Month.
Thank you all so much. Hey, let's do some announcements so that we can get to the lizards. First and foremost, we have a Patreon. Everything we do on the podcast is supported by our patrons. In return for their support, patrons get all sorts of bonus goodies, bonus content, live streams with us, merch, all sorts of things like that. And at certain levels, patrons get their names shouted out here on the podcast. This episode, we would like to welcome and shout out new patrons, Jenna, Paula, Hailstrom, Allie, Maria, Zubin, and Undiluted Bio-Nerd.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for all your support.
Welcome, and thank you all so much. Many of our new patrons are specifically supporting us at the Snakes and Crocs tier on Patreon, which is exclusive to the summer, because as we mentioned before, July is Snake Month, and that means we've got all sorts of special Snake Month stuff going on. Over on our Discord, the Snake Stuff channel will be open and available for snake discussions exclusively this month. We're going to have a Snake Month live stream on World Snake Day, July 16th. Join us for that. And over on our Patreon, the exclusive Snakes and Crocs tier is available only until the end of July. If you sign up at this tier, you get Snake Month stickers, but also you contribute to charitable donations that we will be making towards reptile conservation later in the summer. This year, our donations will be split between the Crocodile Research Coalition, Save the Snakes, and here in the U.S., the National Parks Conservation Association, which supports the preservation of our natural parks, our wilderness, and all of the reptiles and other creatures that live in those areas, which can use all the support they can get, especially these days where our national parks are struggling.
Yes.
Speaking of ways to support us and engage with us, we have a physical mailbox, and sometimes people like to send us physical mail. Will, we got something recently.
Yeah, we got an awesome gift from Ali. We got a lovely letter that explains the piece of rock that was enclosed is a chunk of serpentine from California, a rock structure known from there, named for the texture that is sometimes compared to snake skin-like texture.
Yeah, a very fitting Snake Month gift. And also, we are one of, I assume, very few podcasts that will get excited about being sent a rock as a present.
Yes. It was very neat looking.
It's so cool. Serpentine is a very cool rock.
Yes.
Thank you for that, Ali. Hey, listeners, if you want to send us goodies, find our mailing address on our website. Link in the episode description. But if you want to get a little bit closer than that, later this month, we will be hosting a museum meetup in Drumheller, Alberta. I will be at the Royal Tyrrell Museum with Nora of the world-famous Leave It to Us podcast on Saturday, July 9th. We are going to be doing a meetup with fans. So if you are in the area and you want to come say hi and explore the museum with us and if all goes according to plan, meet and interact with some of the people who work at the museum. Come say hi. We're going to be meeting up at 1 p.m. on Saturday, July 19th at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in, I guess, the lobby, probably, wherever like the front doors are. We'll probably be over there. So come find us and meet us and hang out with us. The last meetup we did was at the Gray Fossil Site, which was super fun. And sometime in the not too distant future, we hope to do one at the Fern Bank in Atlanta.
Yes.
One last thing before we get into the sciencey stuff. July isn't only Snake Month, it's also Disability Pride Month. So shout out to everybody out there who is celebrating Disability Pride Month. Down in the episode description, we're going to put a couple of links to places where you can get resources and support relevant to this month's celebration. We'll have a link to ameridisability.com, which is a site that provides news and resources relevant to people with disabilities, and to the National Disability Rights Network, which is a US-wide, effectively, database of resources across the country. Both of these links are US-specific. They both provide lots of resources. They both, I believe, accept donations and contributions. So check them out if you are so interested. And we hope that everybody has a lovely July for whatever reason you find for it to be important to you.
Absolutely.
Those are some announcements. Let's get to the news. Every episode, before we get into our main episode discussion topic, we like to talk about some news from paleontology and related sciences. Keeps us all up to date. Will, I'm going to go first. I have a real quick one before we get to our main news list. There's a new species from the Gray Fossil Site.
Okay, I'm going to allow it.
This is a new species of salamander published by a friend of the podcast, Davis Gunnan, et al. In the journal Historical Biology. Actually, Davis and Shay, who were both in episode 13, and Shay returned for episode 198, both on this paper, as is Keela Bredehoft from one of our Patron mini episodes where we talked about hellbenders. Shay Maiden. I didn't say the last name on that one. We will link in the blog post to an article at WJHL by Murray Lee. Real quick, this is a new species of desmognathan salamander. So these are, today they're called dusky salamanders. This one is called Deinamognathus robertsoni. Very cool. It is notable for being gigantic. It is a giant dusky salamander. Now, today's dusky salamanders get to like half a foot long, 6-7 inches. This one is estimated from the remains and the fossils to have gotten around 16 inches long.
Wow.
Which is over a foot. This is now this is still quite much smaller than like hellbenders and true giant salamanders, but it is a giant dusky salamander.
No, if I stumbled across a salamander this big, I would be freaking out. That's awesome.
It also seems to have had a very powerful set of jaws and some similarities in, I believe this was in the skull mainly, to some modern burrowing salamanders. So, Davis and the rest point out that this might be, that for a while in this area, giant burrowing salamanders might have been an important part of salamander ecosystems that we don't have today.
Interesting.
Which is very cool. And especially fun in Tennessee because that area, the southern Appalachian Mountains region, is the world's hotbed of salamander diversity today among living species. So to find ancient things that show us how salamander communities have changed over time, very cool stuff.
That's awesome. Man, just little sandworm salamanders coming out with their biting stuff.
Just a little giant salamander.
That's great. I like that a lot.
All right, now you can do the news.
Well, my first news is actually really ill-themed to this episode because it's about trackways.
How dare you?
It's kind of rude.
Frankly, rude.
But very cool, very old trackways. This is research on trackways from the Ediacaran pre-Cambrian explosion and interpretations of what kinds of creatures might have been making said trackways.
Ooh, at a time where we know very little about anything that was walking at that time.
Exactly. This is research by Zequan Wong and Olmo Miguez Salas. in Geoscience World, and the article is a press release from Science Daily. So, Cambrian explosion, we've discussed this before on the podcast.
Episode 9.
This was a big event where a bunch of biodiversity in the fossil record is suddenly able to be seen, mostly because this is when we see the adaptation of mineralized body structures. So, exoskeletons, mineralized mouth parts, etc., things that fossilize well. There was life going on before that, but they did not fossilize well because life was mostly squishy before the Cambrian explosion. This has led to a difficulty in determining how much of the Cambrian explosion started when we get those fossils and how much of it started before the Cambrian explosion. Did it really start in the Cambrian, or did it start a good bit before? They just didn't fossilize well until the Cambrian. The Ediacaran is a famous period before the Cambrian that has the Ediacaran biota, a bunch of extremely weird soft-bodied organisms that may or may not be animals for some of them.
Episode 31.
Some of these could have been the sparking, some of the members of the Ediacaran biota may have been the actual beginnings of the Cambrian explosion, but it's hard to determine because we don't have good fossils from there. What we do have some of is trace fossils. Trackways, footprints from organisms during the Ediacaran. Now, we don't know who made those because they did not fossilize because they were squishy. But taking a look at these trackways and looking at the measurements of them might give us an idea of what kind of body they likely had, which may give us some more indications as to what life was doing pre-Cambrian.
Episode 118.
This is looking at the measurements of the trackways to try to determine body proportions that would fit said trackway. They're looking at like the trajectory of the trackway, the force and displacement that is suggested by the tracks, and then how these features of the trackways correlate together to potentially match up with body types, shapes of body. They looked at modern and other extinct fossil trackways to find what this ratio, what this relationship is between the trackways and the body shapes, and then looked at some Ediacaran and Cambrian trace fossils to see potentially what kind of body shapes they had. And they found that there does seem to be a relationship between the tracks and body shapes. There is a system that can be used to match up general shapes. And what they found from these Ediacaran trace fossils is that they likely had long, slender bodies.
Now we're talking.
Yep. Back on topic.
We're getting there. We're halfway there.
They said that this also suggests, based off the kind of tracks they have, that they had muscles, that they were moving via muscles.
Okay.
Which is one of those things that doesn't seem like a thing you'd have to wonder about. But going back this far, you do.
Yep.
That they probably had a front and back end.
Okay. Also not a given in the Ediacaran.
Exactly. A bunch of these are ones where you're like, okay. It's like, no. At this point,
believe it or not, this animal had a butt.
Yes, exactly. What?
One of the first butts.
Likely had a body cavity that was hydrostatic, so like actually, containing its own environment inside its body and not just sharing, like jellyfish mostly just kind of have the same pressures and stuff as the water around them. This is likely an animal more like what we typically think of animals having their own deal going on inside their body. And they were able to find a trend of gradually increasing minimal body length to width ratio over time. That they did see a shifting in the shape of the body that they were finding on average.
So they were getting longer.
Yeah. So they do have some indications of what shape of critter. Now, what type of critter it was that made this, we still don't know. It was very likely a soft-bodied organism, or at least softer-bodied, so it wasn't fossilizing, so we do not have a definite on who was making this. What it does suggest is that this was an organism that was moving, very much like what we think of other limbed organisms moving around, like velvet worms and even early crustacean type things.
Velvet worm has been the image in my head
Yes.
as you've been
Yep.
describing this.
That's a really good fit and probably a very accurate one. They also note that this indicates it likely was able to move directionally, purposefully, not just aimlessly. Like when we think of sea stars moving around, they are not sensing their environment in a very much, I'm going this way very purposely. They're kind of moving until they smell something. This seems to indicate much more purposeful movement, which suggests that they were able to sense their environment in a at least somewhat sophisticated way. And they note that all of this together does lean some evidence toward the Cambrian explosion actually starting earlier than previously it may have seemed, and that these features could be some of the ones that may have been part of the sparking of said explosion, that advanced senses have often been associated with Cambrian explosion of evolution of eyes and stuff, changing the feeding dynamics between predator and prey. This seems to indicate that some of that sensory setup may have been getting in place in the Ediacaran and could have been some of the sparking events for the later explosion.
Yeah, one of the real core hallmarks of the Cambrian explosion is the change in the way that organisms interacted with their environment.
Yes.
We see changes in the amount of burrowing, we see adaptations for swimming. So it makes perfect sense that you would also start to see changes in how creatures are moving around on the seafloor.
Yeah. So it may have started with people are walking places. What's up with that? Back in the Ediacaran. Yes. And then it got really crazy in the Cambrian. They also know that this is a new approach, a new way that we can analyze that, using this sort of mathematical relationship between the features of the traces and the shape of the body can be used further in other situations and other sites.
Very cool stuff.
Yeah.
Well, my next bit of news is also not super on topic. It's about Denisovans, which, to be fair, we have not found their limbs. So, I don't know, they're effectively limbless for now.
They were Naga.
They were snake people. Listen, if Denisovans were snake people, I'm on board. This is research that identifies a part of the Denisovan body that has never been seen before. And it's a real important part.
Cool.
This is research. That's actually two papers that both deal with this same discovery. Both are Xiaomei Fu et al., one in the journal Science and one in Cell. And in the blog post, we will link to an article by Tim Verneman in National Geographic. So, some background. As some of our listeners may remember, back in 2010, researchers published on ancient human remains, fragmentary bones of some kind of ancient human, whose DNA, when tested, revealed a distinct lineage. Not Homo sapiens, not Neanderthals, not somebody different. They became to be known as Denisovans because the first ones were found in Denisova Cave in Siberia. They have since been identified by genetics from a bunch, something like a dozen or somewhere between like 15 and 20 bits and pieces. These are some finger bones, which I guess are limbs, some finger bones, some teeth, some other bone fragments, ranging from the middle to the late Pleistocene, between around 300,000 to around 25,000 years. All of these have been identified as Denisovans based on DNA and proteins, based on molecular components. All of the fossils of Denisovans are tiny bits and pieces. Like that finger bone and some teeth are the best examples that we have, which means we don't actually know what Denisovans looked like. We don't have their skeletons, we don't have their anatomy, and they don't have an official diagnosis. They don't have an official species name or anything because there's no morphology that we could use to identify it.
Yes, we don't have enough to name a species off of.
Exactly. This new research presents what appears to be a Denisovan skull. This is a famous skull. This is called the Harbin skull, which was discovered way back in 1933 in Harbin City, China. It dates to at least 146,000 years old. It is a nearly complete skull, notable for a bunch of features that make it distinct from other hominins. These are, little things. The shape of the size of the teeth, the shape of the brow ridge, the shape of the eye sockets are all just different enough that researchers have suspected this might be a different lineage of hominin. And in 2021, I think we may have talked about this on the podcast, a paper came out that identified the Harbin skull as belonging to a new species, which they named Homo longi, aka Dragon Man. I think Dragon Man might have been the name that was around before. I don't remember. This identification was controversial, identifying a new species of hominin. It got a lot of critiques and discussion and debate as to whether or not this is really different enough for us to call it a new species. So that name has kind of gone back and forth a little bit. These two new papers sampled molecular material from the Harbin skull. The first paper did a protein analysis. They found a whole bunch of they were looking at amino acid variations, which are a type of protein in our bodies, and found 3 amino acid variants that have only ever been found in Denisovan fossils.
Okay.
And that they are actually a close match to the original finger bone from Denisova Cave in Siberia. The second paper did a DNA test on the Harbin skull. They noted that they were unable to get DNA from the teeth or from the petrosal, which is a bone more central in the skull that's often really good at getting DNA. But they were able to get mitochondrial DNA from dental calculus, from the plaque on the teeth. And within there, they found 27 gene variants only known from Denisovan fossils. Many questions remain, but Denisovan, this lineage of hominins, has only ever been identified from genetics and proteins. And based on that evidence, the Harbin skull appears to be a Denisovan skull.
That's awesome.
This is extremely cool because A, it's been 15 years since Denisovans were first described. If we have a skull that's so cool, it means we can start making interpretations about Denisovan anatomy or adaptations. It means we can compare this skull with other skulls.
Yes.
This is the big thing that has been missing for Denisovans, which is if you can't get DNA, there's no way to know if it's a Denisovan. Now, if this is truly a Denisovan skull, the paper actually mentioned that there are other skulls that researchers in the past have pointed to being similar to this skull. Now, if they can be confirmed, or maybe we go look at those for genetic analysis, this is going to open up a lot of doors for us to start finding more Denisovan remains.
That's so exciting.
It's super cool. Now, the National Geographic article does go into the big question, which also came up on our Discord with people who were talking about this news. Does that give us a species for Denisovans? Because this skull has been given a species identification. If it's a Denisovan, do the Denisovans now, is that what Denisovans are? Are Denisovans Homo longi? The National Geographic article actually has a little discussion with this, and they have, I think they quote one researcher who says, absolutely, let's do it, and another researcher who says, well, maybe not. But the maybe not researcher is mostly, it sounds like, they just disagree with that skull being different enough to be a different species.
Yes.
And that Denisovans themselves maybe should not be considered a different species. In general, they might just be a different lineage of our species. So the debate as to whether or not this gives Denisovans a species name really does seem to come down to whether or not Denisovans should get a species name at all, separate from the rest of us hominins. So this skull is certainly going to be the center of lots more research and debate and discussion for the next, forever, probably. Because this isn't like half a skull and we wait till we find a better one. This is a basically complete skull of what appears to be Denisovans.
Very cool.
It's
Well, and
so cool.
it's such an interesting question because, like, yeah, does that mean we now have a species name which will not be, necessarily have Denisovan anywhere in it? Uh,
Yeah.
which is always a interesting moment when that happens with scientific names of like, hey, so I know we all call it this. Technically, we should be calling it this other name. I know there's no way we're gonna stop calling it the name that we all know it by.
Yes. Well, that's what happened with mastodons. Like the
Yes.
word mastodon was originally supposed to be the scientific name of that group, but it ended up being superseded by an earlier name. So they are scientifically mammoth and mammotids, but the
Yes.
common name mastodons stuck. And now we have both.
Yep. Well, and it's like megalodon, where like that species epithet has stuck around, but its genus name has changed multiple times, and there's a possibility that we could go, actually, it is the same species as this one that was discovered before it, and it's no longer megalodon. We're never going to stop calling it megalodon
Yes.
because that's a great name. So yeah, it's interesting, and on top of that, the species name they might have is debated. And
Yes.
so it's this like, should we be calling them this name that isn't the name we've been calling them? And is that name a valid name?
Yes. And should they have a name at all? Should they
Yes.
just be Homo
Or
sapiens denisovansis?
yeah, exactly. It's so interesting.
Yeah, so stay tuned for more brawling paleoanthropologists.
Very cool. Well, my next news fits in with that nicely because it is about people still, specifically something we made and new dates for how old it is. This is about a mammoth tusk boomerang.
Oh yeah, I saw this. This was
Yeah.
also, I will point out, a long, slender thing with no legs.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
we're on topic.
We're bringing it back in. This is research by Saratalamo et al. In PLOS ONE, and the article is by Andrew Paul in Popular Science. This is an artifact from a period called the Early Aurignacian, which is an Upper Paleolithic time, and it's when humans started migrating across Europe in large numbers. So it's a important period to understand human history. Boomerangs have shown up throughout human history. Boomerangs are not just an Australian artifact and tool. They are known from Europe, North Africa, and ancient Egypt, evidently.
Oh, cool.
And there's some of the oldest tools that we know of. There's a cave art in Australia that goes back to 50,000 years old that depict people using boomerangs.
That's cool.
So boomerangs are a well-known human tool. This one's from Poland. This is from a cave in Poland discovered in 1985. This is from Oblazowa Cave, which is a really like famous Paleolithic site in Poland. And it was found associated with a human phalanx. So human material, maybe the boomerang's owner, who knows?
Who lost a finger. Mishandling their boomerang.
Right? You got to be careful. It's about 2.36 feet across. The boomerang is
Not the finger bone.
not the finger bone.
Yeah, a 2.5-foot long boomerang seems pretty big.
Yeah, not bad. This is not a boomerang as we typically think of them today, where it's meant to arc around and come back to you. Hunting boomerangs weren't often meant to do that. There were some that I've heard talked about using maybe to scatter ducks and stuff, scatter birds. But the actual hunting boomerangs are just thrown weapons. You throw it, it goes in a straight line, hits the animal, either kills or stuns them, and then you go get your meal.
Yes. If your boomerang comes back to you, you didn't hit anything.
Yes. Yep. You can't hit it. As much as video games would have us believe otherwise, if you hit something with your boomerang, it does not bounce back like Captain America's shield.
That thing doesn't obey the laws of physics at all.
This study wanted to get a more precise dating on the boomerang. Previous dates were about 30,000 years old. They wanted to take a closer look. They looked at other artifacts. This cave includes remains from both Neanderthal and human occupants and artifacts from those groups, including things like pendants and maybe a whistle, which
Ooh.
is something I hadn't heard of, made from a snail shell, which is cool. They refined the dates using radiocarbon dating, looked at several bones and the human phalanx associated with the boomerang, as well as the ivory of the boomerang. And they got dates closer to between specifically 42,810 to 38,550,000 years ago. And for the
Okay.
boomerang, specifically 42,290 to 39,280,000 years. So closer to 40,000 years than 30,000, which just new updated date for this boomerang. It does make it the Europe's oldest example of this kind of tool. So it's now just a refinement. The research is really just a refinement of the dating. I mostly wanted to talk about the news because I didn't know we had mammoth tusk boomerangs
I
lying
also
around.
did not know that. That's very and in my mind, when you said how big it is, I went, okay, that makes more sense than the image
Yes.
in my head, which was like a 12-foot long mammoth
Yeah.
tusk boomerang.
It was like the ribs that they put on the side of the Flintstones car.
Yes, and
Just
it's just the
boomerang.
entire family has to work together to throw it.
Yeah, this is much more moderate sized boomerang, but there are notable things about it. Like, it is a well crafted tool, which suggests, the skill to make such a tool, that it was potentially a prized object.
Mm-hmm.
They do note that there aren't any fragments of ivory in the cave, so the boomerang was likely made somewhere else and
Sure.
brought to the cave, which potentially suggests that it was a treasured, something that they were taking with them, not just
Mm-hmm.
made and used and then, one and done sort of thing. And so, it is also an important artifact in just understanding human craftsmanship and our relation to it during this time in this part of the world.
Yeah. Well, and you also pointed out that there are both our lineage and Neanderthal remains in that
Mm-hmm.
cave, which I don't know if there's a way to tell if who made this or
Mm-hmm.
which group made this. I also wonder if you could look at signs of wear on the boomerang to see if or how it was used.
Yeah, they didn't mention any sort of thing like that. They did note that there is the way they put it was intentional thinning of it to achieve symmetry, that there is notably, it
Mm,
was worked to be symmetrical and thinned very precisely. So, like, it is a very sculpted piece. It is the picture of it,
yeah,
it is beautiful. Like, it's really cool looking.
that's very cool.
Yeah.
Awesome stuff. Well, hey, let's do one more bit of news. My last bit of news for us is about lizards. I'm bringing us back to the main topic. These are
And now
lizards
we're
that
on track.
these are lizards that have legs, but we're getting close. Specifically, this is research about how a group of lizards responded to the end Cretaceous mass extinction. This is research in Biology Letters by Chase Brownstein et al., and we will link in the blog post to an article in Live Science by Patrick Pester. The lizards in question are Xanthusiidae, which is a family that are often called night lizards.
Both those names are cool.
Night lizards, very cool. As the name suggests, they are mostly nocturnal. They are relatively small. They're closely related to skinks, though they are not themselves skinks. They're often very secretive. They live in like rock crevices and
Mhm.
vegetation and stuff like that. Today, there are only about 30 species of night lizards that fit into 3 different genera. They live across Central America and up into the southern parts of North America. So they're a relatively restricted group of lizard. We will not be talking about them later in the episode because this is a group that has not become legless. This study used genetic material and just our understanding of the lifestyles of the living species to put together an evolutionary tree and figure out how have they developed over time, and in particular, what were their earliest ancestors most likely like. In particular, they wanted to know what were they doing around the end of the Cretaceous when the asteroid hit and the mass extinction happened. Based on their genetic analysis, they estimate that this family originated around 90 million years ago, which is in the late Cretaceous. So they would have been around for the end Cretaceous extinction. And they found that there are two different main lineages within the family. One that includes 29 of the species, and the other lineage is the one species in the genus Cricosauria, which are Cuban night lizards, which seem to be a separate lineage from all the other living night lizards.
Oh, neat.
And they find that those lineages appear to have split before the end of the Cretaceous,
Huh.
which means both of these lineages were present for that extinction event and survived, which is very cool to know. And most intriguingly, based on their modern distribution where they live and what we can tell from their evolutionary tree and ancestry, there doesn't seem to be any evidence or reason to think that they ever lived anywhere else in the world.
Okay.
Which means that they seem to have been living in and around Central America the whole time. And that's where the asteroid hit.
Yeah.
Which suggests that not only did these lineages survive the end Cretaceous extinction event, they survived it within like sight of that asteroid impact. They were nearby in that area. The paper points out that this makes them the only known group of tetrapods that is known to have survived this event near the impact site.
Wow.
Which is extremely good. Now, obviously, they weren't under the asteroid, but they were in like the worst parts of the world to be in when the asteroid hit.
Well, it's one of those rare circumstances because usually we have to explain that the rock hitting Earth isn't what wiped out every dinosaur. That's not how it didn't hit and they all got exploded.
Yes.
It hit, a bunch of them around it died, and then it caused a bunch of side effects. This is one of those rare times where we actually have to talk about the area around it and going, well, no, evidently some animals hung on in ground zero effectively.
So the asteroid hit in the Yucatan Peninsula. Go listen to episode 5 where we talked all about it. These lizards appear to have been in Central America at the time, which of course raises the question of how did they survive in the hardest hit parts of the world? And the authors point out a handful of potential answers. These lizards tend to be very small, secluded. They tend to live underground or in the vegetation where they might have been sheltered. They also have a low metabolism, so they don't need a lot of food. They don't use up a lot of energy. Their ancestral reconstruction, based on the evolutionary tree that they put together, also suggests that the earliest night lizards had small clutch sizes.
Okay.
Likely only one or two offspring at a time. And that's really interesting because that is the opposite of what we tend to assume about what helps you survive an extinction. When we talk about birds and mammals, there's evidence to suggest that having lots of babies was part of what allowed them to survive so well because, you know, the numbers are in your favor. This is a group of reptiles that seems to have not done that and still survived in a really difficult part of the world.
Yeah.
So this all, you know, there's very few solid answers to be had so far, but it suggests there were multiple ways to survive this extinction, even in the hardest hit region of the world. And likely this is not unique to these lizards. The paper, I think it was in the paper, they point out probably there were other groups in this area that survived. You know, you had turtles and you had other lizards, but night lizards are the only group that we know of that survived in this area and is still in this area today.
Yeah.
So we can directly compare them to their ancestors from the same region.
That's fascinating.
It's very cool. They are a unique insight into extinction survival.
Yeah, I gotta say though, if I were a conspiracy theorist, it casts them in a very suspicious light. If you're telling me you were there for the event and you made it out fine, scot-free, I don't know. Sounds like you had some foreknowledge.
And you're still here.
Yeah.
Didn't even leave. Didn't have the good sense to leave.
Yeah, no. Yeah, when it's the fact that they're still in the same place it's I had the thought initially when you mentioned the one group that is separated and seems to have been separated since the Cretaceous, where I was like, wow, that it's always interesting to me when that happens, and that group isn't the weirdo. Like
Mm.
obviously the weirdo. It's this group has stayed fairly similar enough that we didn't realize they were actually that distantly separated until looking at it this way is always interesting to me, because it means that you didn't go off and become a weird member of the group. You just kept doing what that group was doing, but technically more distantly related.
Yeah.
But you're living where you lived back then, and like this group seems to be very comfortable and just doing what they've been doing the whole time, which is just very interesting.
They're like the lizard version of the grandma from Dante's Peak,
Yeah.
who's like, I'm not leaving. This is my home. I don't care
Yes,
what
yes.
happens.
Yep. Cool.
Well, that's a bunch of news, and we're done. So let's get to the main episode discussion. We're going to talk all about legless lizards, and we're going to start with a discussion about what exactly we're talking about when we discuss leglessness in animals.
Is the an alternate segue could have been, what would make these lizards even cooler is if they lost some legs.
Maybe some more lizards, who didn't struggle to survive in Cretaceous extinction? Snakes. They did great, and now they live all over the world. So yeah, night lizards, sure, whatever.
That's what's keeping you in this restricted area.
That's why you can't get anywhere.
These darn legs.
Your legs keep getting stuck in those crevices. All right, musical interlude. We'll be right back. The term legless lizards can refer to a whole bunch of different lizards, a whole bunch of different groups of lizards, some of which aren't even fully legless. There are some groups of lizards that their common name is legless lizards. We are not going to be talking specifically about any one of those groups, but instead, this is a big overview of the phenomenon of leglessness in lizards. There are tons of members of this family tree that have reduced their limbs. Limb reduction is not unique to lizards. It is actually very common in the evolutionary history of a lot of groups of animals. Limb reduction just means that the limbs themselves, and specifically the pieces that make up the limbs, right, our femurs and humeri and finger and toe bones, have become lost or diminished over time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
This is super common. This happens in tons of different groups, right? Theropod dinosaurs are a very famous example. T-Rex, those front arms are not only small, but only have 2 fingers on each hand because the rest has been diminished. Horses are a great example of limb reduction because horses have big, strong legs, but they have lost most of the bones in those legs. They are down to 1 digit in each foot.
Yeah, most of your hoofed animals have digit reduction.
Yes. So loss of limb elements, reduction of the limbs is pretty common. A particularly interesting pattern that recurs over and over again in different groups is the association of limb reduction with elongation of the body.
Yeah.
Where you get long-bodied animals with small or absent limbs. The famous example of this is snakes, this snake-like body shape, but this has happened over and over again. This has happened multiple times, for example, in amphibians, including in some salamanders, in caecilians, as well as some temnospondyls. We mentioned some of them in episode 212. This has happened multiple times in fish. We talked about a bunch of those in episode 198 when we talked about eels. This has even happened to an extent in certain groups of mammals, right? Cetaceans are the go-to example, whales and dolphins, who have a long body shape, and the hind legs have been reduced down to basically nothing. Also, ferrets and weasels, mustelids like that, are sometimes brought up. as they are longer bodied with short legs.
Even like seals.
And see, yeah, absolutely. This is a recurring feature. Exactly how this happens in terms of what is changing about the body can vary. So the elongation can be lengthening of the body or the tail, or in some fish, especially the head can become longer, and that's part of the lengthening of the body, right? Cetaceans, whales, and dolphins have very long tails. Caecilians do not have tails. They are a long body. This can also be done by adding vertebrae or by stretching out the vertebrae that you have. Some long-bodied salamanders just have long vertebrae instead of more vertebrae. And the reduction of the limbs can be losing certain bones. It can just be retaining most of the bones, but shrinking them down to a smaller size. So there's a bunch of different ways to achieve this. Squamates is the group of reptiles that is the lizards. Lizards and all of the things within and close by to lizards. Squamates are the best at this. Limb reduction of some form is thought to have happened possibly over 60 different times across the lizard family tree, and snake-like shapes, like the full long body, very small to absent limbs, is thought to have evolved in lizards at least 24 times.
It's ridiculous.
This is just a way that lizards love to be. If you look at across the whole lizard family tree, almost every major subgroup has members that are snake-like in their shape. In fact, it is quicker to list the groups of lizards that don't have snake-like lizards in them. This is an extremely common recurring feature. Typically in lizards, they're getting longer by adding vertebrae to the body and or the tail, and it is very common that they reduce all four legs. As opposed to, your cetaceans, which have reduced the hind limbs, or some dinosaurs that reduced the front limbs. Snake-like lizards tend to lose all four. There's a lot of variety in how they've gone about this and what they look like. There's also a lot of variety in how successful they are when they do it. There are two groups of lizards that have achieved this snake-like body shape and become extremely successful. One are the amphisbaenians, which are also called worm lizards. There are over 200 species living today. They live all over the world. If you haven't ever heard of them or haven't ever seen them, that is probably because they are pretty much exclusively subterranean. This is a group of burrowing lizards that are all long-bodied, basically entirely limbless. There are exceptions. We will get to that a bit later. So they are a very successful group that lives like worms, essentially.
Yep.
And indeed, this is a group that is often referred to separately from lizards. They are within lizards, but sometimes they'll be referred to as amphisbaenians and lizards. That they are so different that they are brought out.
Well, it's like the birds and dinosaurs.
Absolutely. Or like snakes.
Yep.
Which snakes are lizards, but they're so different and diverse that we call them by a different name. Snakes are the other extraordinarily successful group of legless lizards. Amphisbaenians have just over 200 species all around the world. They are number 2. They are the second most successful group of legless lizards. Snakes, there are over 4,000 species in the world today. They are not only the most successful long-bodied legless lizards, but the most successful long-bodied legless vertebrate animals.
Yeah.
This is why it's called snake-shaped. But we don't call it amphisbaenian shaped because they don't have 4,000 species. Snakes are all long-bodied. Most snakes have no remnant of either the front legs or the back legs. A handful of families do have some lingering remnants of the hind limbs, but even those are extremely small and extremely reduced. Amphisbaenians and snakes are two big, successful radiations of the legless lizard body shape, but there are also smaller groups, more restricted diversifications of this shape. For example, in Australia, there are the pygopodids, which are sometimes called snake lizards or flap-footed lizards. These are legless geckos.
Yes.
This is a group of about 50 species that lives in Australia and New Guinea. They have no front limbs, but they have very tiny little flap-like back legs. Pygopods are I think pygopods are very fun because when we talk about how can you tell a legless lizard apart from a snake, there are a handful of go-to examples. Mainly, snakes don't have external ears, and snakes don't have eyelids.
Right.
And those are often two really quick and easy go-to ways to tell them apart. But pygopods are geckos, so they also don't have eyelids. But because they're geckos, they also don't have a forked tongue.
Yes.
They have the long, squishy gecko tongue that they can use to clean their eyes,
Yeah.
which is very fun.
Me just picturing a snake and one of these meeting each other and being like, are people weirded out by your tongue things? Like, yeah, absolutely. And then licks the eye. Oh, no, not that at all. What is wrong with you?
Well, another interesting difference, that because again, they're geckos, pygopodids are also quite vocal. They make little squeaks and stuff. In fact, I saw one paper has found that one of the pygopod genera makes the highest frequency sounds of any lizards.
Oh.
Which is pretty cool.
I mean, makes people may or may not know it. Geckos are noisy. Like that's where the
Geckos
name
are very
gecko
vocal.
comes from, is the noise at least one species makes.
Yes. Yeah, lizards, reptiles in general, do not normally get onomatopoeic names.
Yes.
Another fairly successful radiation of legless lizards is the subfamily Anguinae. These are often called glass lizards or glass snakes, sometimes slow worms. This is about 20 species. Yeah, slow worms comes up for a few.
I had not heard that before. That one's fantastic.
This is about 20 species that live across the northern continents. So they're here in North America. We have them not exactly where we live, but not too far away. They're also in Europe and Asia. These are all long-bodied. They have no limbs, except sometimes vestigial hind limbs. They are called glass lizards because they can lose their tails, like a lot of lizards can do. So they break, and that's where the glass lizard name comes from. Anguin glass lizards are some of the coolest legless lizards, in my opinion. One of the reasons why they're so cool is because they have osteoderms.
Yeah.
So they are armored snake lizards, which is very cool.
Yeah. This is unsurprisingly my first image of a legless lizard when I hear that term, because it's the ones I grew up around.
Yeah, this is the one. If you were challenged to go find a legless lizard and snakes don't count, this would be your best bet. Yeah. Take a trip across the border to North Carolina and try to find a glass lizard. And then there are a handful of examples that are very minor groups, single genera within larger overall groups. So, for example, my favorite example is the genus Chamaesora, which are grass lizards, not to be confused with glass lizards. These are grass lizards. These live in Africa. There are only 5 species within this genus. The grass lizards are part of the family Cordylidae. Cordylids are girdled lizards, or sometimes I believe they're called armadillo lizards.
Yes.
They are extremely armored and spiky. Some of them roll up into a little ball and like roll away from stuff or to protect themselves.
They bite their little tail.
Yeah, like a little Ouroboros. Chamaesora grass lizards are a legless, long-bodied version of those. It's the only one. This is a big family, and then there's this one genus that has become very long-bodied. They have very long tails, in particular, and they have, at best, tiny little stick-like legs, like barely noticeable when you see pictures of them.
Cool.
There's also the genus Ophiodes, which is in a family called Diploglossidae, which are sometimes called gallywasps. This is another one, diverse family. This genus is 6 species of long body. These are also called glass lizards or glass snakes because they also drop their tails. They have no front legs. They have vestigial hind legs. Another one-off genus. And then there's also, again, coming back to North America, American legless lizards, which are a single genus in their own family, Aniella in Aniellidae, a handful of species in California. They're only in California. That is where they live. They live in that southwestern corner of North America. These are burrowers. They
Okay,
have
yep.
short tails, long bodies, no legs, vestigial pelvic remains. They also, I've seen noted as having one reduced lung, like snakes do. The
Cool.
left lung is vestigial, and I think the left oviduct is also vestigial.
Very neat.
So legless lizards range from being like huge successful groups to little one-off, a genus that has a handful of species in it that occupies like this one little space. And then there are a couple of groups that run the full spectrum, that have not just, right, like cordylids have a bunch of, quote, normal looking lizards, and then that one family of snake-shaped lizards. Gymnothalmids are a family called spectacled lizards. They live in Central and South America. This is a group of lizards that includes lots of short-bodied limbed lizards, some limbless long lizards, and everything in between. There are multiple genera that have evolved long bodies and small limbs. Some have fully lost the forelimbs. The genus Bacchia is famous for being very snake-like, but even within that genus has varying degrees of how short the limbs are, how many fingers they have, varies from species to species. Gymnothalmids have this range of degrees of leglessness. And then there are the champions of degrees of leglessness, which are skinks.
Yeah, I was waiting for skinks to show up.
This is where they are. Skinkidae is the largest lizard family. There are more than 1,700 species of skinks. Almost a third of them have some amount of limb reduction. Limblessness is found in multiple subfamilies of skinks all across mostly the old world. This is
Okay.
Africa, Asia, Europe, Australia. Some studies estimate that loss of limbs has evolved more than 20 times just in skinks.
Wow.
There are several groups of fully limbless species like lance skinks, worm skinks. There's at least one group that's just called limbless skinks. And there are some genera that have the whole spectrum. One of the famous examples of this is the genus Larista, which are an Australian group that are sometimes called sliders.
Mm-hmm.
Within this one genus, there are fully limbed, short-bodied, normal-shaped lizard species with five fingers and toes, all the way to long-bodied, limbless species within one genus. And it's not the only genus that has that.
Wow.
Skinks are sort of the opposite of snakes, I guess, in that regard, where snakes did it once and took off. Skinks took off and have now done snake shape dozens of times.
That's so great. Well, and it's so interesting that because like we've talked about with snakes before that they did a very extreme thing of getting rid of all of their limbs and elongating their bodies into a very specialized morphology that they've then used to become very successful. With skinks, it's interesting to see such closely related members doing both limbed and limbless and being successful in both ways.
Yeah.
That it really brings the question of, you know, how specialized do you actually need to be a successful limbless lizard?
Yeah. And are skinks good at it because there's something about skinks, or is it just that there's so many of them that they become limbless at the same rate as many other families, but there's just a bajillion
Yeah.
skinks, and so
They've
done it more often.
They're just hitting the statistics and playing the odds to the degree of, yeah, there's going to be a lot of successful limbless skinks because there's a lot of skinks.
This means that skinks are often the main group that is studied when we want to understand how loss of limbs happens evolutionarily. I was putting my notes together, and I tried to separate it out to like notes on specific groups and then notes on just the overall trend of limblessness. And there was significant overlap between my skinks list and my overall trends of limblessness list, because skinks, that's where we get a lot of the information.
So we are the trend.
Yep. Now, I should specify, because I called out glass lizards, anguines, for having osteoderms. A bunch of these groups have osteoderms. Skinks have osteoderms. I think the anielids, the American legless lizards, have osteoderms. The grass lizards have osteoderms. So the armored snake lizards is actually also a fairly common recurring trend.
Fantastic.
It is one of the very few ways that you can add a cool thing that snakes didn't already have.
Yes.
Snakes don't do osteoderms, and the idea of a lizard doing a armored snake is very cool. So across lizards, there's lots of different variation in how they achieve this body shape. One paper that I read referred to this as imperfect convergence.
Interesting.
They are converging on the same overall shape, but exactly how they get there tends to vary. Like I pointed out with some of them have longer tails, others have longer bodies, some of them have more limb reduction than others. Typically, the front legs are reduced either before the hind legs or more than the hind legs. If you come across a lizard that has only 2 functional legs, it's going to be the back legs, with some very rare exceptions. Certain worm skinks retain just their front legs, Bacchia among the spectacled lizards, and then some of the worm lizards retain those front legs, but that is quite unusual.
Yeah.
In some groups, the elongation of the body is associated with changes to the internal organs, like we see in snakes, like I mentioned with whichever group it was that I mentioned that with. I think that was the American legless lizards. There are also some patterns we start to notice when we compare all of these different groups. There's variation in how much reduction they have, but there are trends in how the reduction of the limbs happens. For example, and a very key example, the reduction of the limbs starts with the distal elements. That is, the parts of the limbs that are farthest from the body. You lose your fingers and toes before losing wrist bones, and then forearm bones, and then upper arm bones. That is a consistent pattern throughout lizards. There are some cases where the bones have been lost, but the muscles for those bones remain.
Interesting. Yeah.
So there are some species of skinks, for sure, that have muscles that don't attach to the bones, that if you compare them with other lizards. In other lizards, these muscles attach to like the wrist bones or the radius and ulna or whatever. These lizards have that muscle but do not have those bones anymore. There's also been a bunch of research in the embryology of legless lizards to look at like what is happening during development. For example, the fact that fingers are lost before the upper arm bones lines up with embryology, because that's the reverse order that those form in.
Yes.
So if you are cutting off development at a later stage, you end up developing the first parts of the arm and not developing the fingers, for example. A bunch of research has noted that in many groups of legless lizards, it's not just that they don't develop limbs. Often they start developing limbs and then it gets truncated. So the process starts and then it just stops early. And in some, like glass lizards, the limb buds during embryology begin to form and then reverse course and disappear.
I was wondering if that would happen.
Yeah, they start forming them and then they actually revert to a more limbless shape later. Kind of like we do with our tails.
Yes.
And snakes, the front limbs do not, there is, even in embryos, there is no sign of front limbs. And in most of them, the hind limbs don't even begin to form either. Snakes have gone almost as far into limblessness as you can get. Comparing the evolutionary histories of these different groups, we also see that the rate of this evolutionary shift can vary. So there are a bunch. So we'll build a family tree and make estimates based on these relationships as to when certain changes happened in the history of this group. In some lineages, so in the Larista, in the slider skinks, some research has estimated that certain lineages within this group of skinks have gone from fully 5 fingers to 0 fingers in as little as 3.5 million years.
Wow.
On the other hand, there are lots of groups where partially limbed forms, so partway to limblessness, right? Long bodies and small legs, but you still have legs. That, what we might consider an intermediate form, those often seem to persist for tens of millions of years. That it doesn't seem to just be a step on the way towards complete limblessness. A lot of lineages of lizards, that's just what that group is for many millions of years.
Yeah, that's not actually intermediate. It's just a middle option.
Yeah, it's only intermediate if you then do something else afterwards.
Yes, exactly. Like, this is a fully viable way to be a less-legged lizard.
Yes. Yeah, the fact that they're persisting that way for so long suggests that, at the very least, it isn't a detriment to be partially limbed, but that it seems to even be beneficial. That is a very functional way to persist. There might be selective pressures to retain some limb
Yeah,
and not lose the limbs all the way.
which is always a good reminder. This is another one of those examples to show that evolution is not on a path, and that just because our two most common pictures of lizards is very legged and not legged at all does not mean that those are the two most ideal options. They're just the two
Yes.
that are most common right now.
There has also been a bunch of discussion in research about whether or not it is possible to re-evolve lost digits.
Yeah.
And this has gone back and forth because there have been some studies that look at, and this comes down to phylogenetic analysis. We're comparing the relationships between all these lizards and identifying patterns of how things have changed across that family tree. Some studies have found support for the idea that lost digits, lost parts of limbs have returned in certain lineages, but this has been contested by other research. And it really comes down to the reliability of the family tree that you're constructing and our detailed understanding of the anatomy and the genetic history of these groups. So some studies come out and say, yeah, we found evidence of multiple reversals of this process. Other studies say we do not find any evidence of it. At least one study that I read said that their analysis suggested that it was possible, but not very likely or common for it to happen. So whether or not you can re-evolve lost parts of legs is kind of up in the air. It's one of those things that, like, theoretically we can come up with ways to make it work. Like we can come up with, like, yeah, this is how something like that might happen, but whether or not it actually has happened in lizards is debated.
And it's an interesting question, because if it did happen, would it be more likely that it's a like reactivation of the genes for that digit, or did you duplicate one of the remaining digits, and so you reduce down to 3 digits, and then you duplicated your ring finger, so now you have 4 digits, but 2 of them are both ring fingers.
Yeah, you have 4 digits, but you don't have a pinky.
Exactly. Like your new pinky is just a second ring finger. And both of those make
You
sense.
get married twice.
Yes, exactly. This is for polyamorous species only. Both of those situations make sense that they could happen, but they do seem odd. Like,
Yeah.
that seems like a weird thing to happen.
Another very discussed aspect of limbless lizards, and another thing that is fairly consistent throughout them, is their lifestyle. Legless lizards are almost always fossorial, so burrowing, or semi-fossorial.
Yeah.
Most limbless lizards spend their time either in the sediment or on the ground cover, right? Moving through leaf litter, moving on the surface, in and out of the soil. They are very ground based.
Yes.
Legless lizards tend to move by undulating the body the way that snakes do. This form of locomotion, what they're doing is they're making curves in the body that they are pushing off of the environment with. This is one of the reasons why being long-bodied and legless is thought to maybe be good for moving across cluttered ground environments, because there's a lot for you to push those curves against to move forward. And the limbs are out of the way, so you don't have to worry about them getting caught. In tight spaces, some limbless lizards also will use what's called concertina locomotion, which is basically inchworm locomotion, where you like move the front part of the body forward and then pull the back part and then move the front and then pull the back. Very useful for moving through burrows and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Research has found that there is this relatively smooth transition where, as lizard species get longer bodies and smaller limbs, they move more by undulating. So lizards that are kind of, most lizards move kind of side to side anyway, because that's sort of the way that they move. Lizards that are sort of in between, like somewhat elongated and somewhat limb reduced, often will undulate their tails, and then fully snake-shaped lizards will often undulate their body and tail together. So you get this transition from walking into this undulating snake locomotion.
Cool.
Reduced limbs are also often associated with reinforced musculature in the ribs and the vertebrae, which suggests that the anatomy is also shifting away from musculature to power the legs towards musculature to power the movement of the body. Research has also found that being snake-shaped in some lizards makes them better at moving through, for example, sediment. So among those slider skinks, again, the Larista, that have every version of limbed or limblessness that you can have as a lizard, the longer-bodied, smaller-limbed ones are better at moving through the sand. These are sand-swimming lizards. The more snake-shaped they are, the better they are at moving through the sand. This seems to be a really effective body shape for that lifestyle.
Cool.
Generally speaking, legless lizards are often considered to be on a spectrum with two ecomorphs on either side of that spectrum. You've got burrowers and what are sometimes called grass swimmers.
Yeah.
Lizards that move through the, like our glass lizards here in North America are grass swimming. Burrowers have short tails and surface dwellers have long tails.
Okay.
This is a spectrum. So it's not like you're one or the other. There's lots of intermediate gradation, but this does seem to be a general trend in how the body shape is related to the way that they move. Like I said, our glass lizards here are really good at moving over the ground. Glass lizards also have very long tails. The African grass lizards, Kamesora, the girdled lizard, snake-shaped ones, are also, I've seen them referred to as grassland specialists.
Cool.
They are experts at moving through the grass. They also have extremely long tails. The slider skinks tend to be semi-fossorial. And then some groups of skinks, like the genus Chalcides, includes a full spectrum of lifestyles. So some of them are fully burrowing, and some of them are fully surface dwelling, and some of them are in between.
Neat.
But these are the main ways that legless lizards tend to live. Multiple groups of legless lizards have gone all the way to becoming specialized subterranean animals, specialized burrowers. There's a bunch of these. There are blind legless skinks in Africa, the genus Typhlosaurus. They are worm-like. They have small, reduced eyes. They have a blunt nose and a blunt tail. They look like a big worm. They spend basically all their time under the ground. Here in the Americas, the American legless lizards also are worm-like, blunt tail. Sometimes they'll have a shovel-shaped snout for pushing through the sediment. They also have lost their external ears and have reduced their eyes. There's another group that I haven't even mentioned yet, a whole other family, which are called blind skinks. They are not skinks. They are dibamids, which is a group that is mostly found in Australasia that are an outgroup to most other lizards. This is an early branching group, Dibamidae. These are very worm-like, blunt head, blunt tails. They also have very fused and reinforced skulls. The skull bones are all sort of tightly fused together. And they have reduced eyes that are covered in a scale.
Oh, yeah.
So they're not even using them anymore.
Cool.
There are also snakes that have adapted in the same sort of way. There are worm-like burrowing snakes. There are blind snakes. There are amphisbaenians that are, in fact, most amphisbaenians are adapted in a very similar way. We'll talk more about them later. So the spectrum for legless lizards goes from swimming around in the grass to never seeing the sun.
Yes.
But they are ground-based animals for the most part.
Which is notably less diversity of habitats than we see in snakes.
Yes. This is one of those things that and now most snakes are doing those things.
Yes,
Right?
absolutely.
Most snakes are burrowing or ground dwelling, but legless lizards generally don't tend to achieve that same diversity of lifestyles that we see in snakes.
Yeah, because like one of the biggest things I think of snakes being good at is climbing. You know,
Yes.
even though not all of them are tree-dwelling snakes, a lot of even your ground-dwelling snakes can climb a tree.
Yes. Yeah, legless lizards, I don't know of any legless lizards that are tree specialists.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are some that can climb trees. I'm sure if you put one in a tree, it can figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
But they tend not to leave the ground. They're very terrestrial focused.
Very interesting.
Now, another really interesting note about legless lizards, I mentioned a little while ago that, not only are legless lizards extremely common, but most legless lizards are not actually legless.
Yes.
Most of them have some remaining little tiny legs. It is way more common, in fact, for legless lizards to have some legs left than to be completely absent of limb. And this doesn't seem to be just that, they're stuck that way. They use those legs.
Mm-hmm.
There has been research that has found research on skinks, research on the gallywasps that has found that nearly all species, if they have limbs, use them to help with moving around.
Yeah.
So even if they're mostly undulating or moving through the soil or whatever, if they have legs, they are using those legs to help move themselves around. And you can imagine that a leg might be useful for like getting unstuck from something. There's a lot of ways that it might be nice to have little limbs that can help out with getting around the environment.
Oh, yeah, because even if you're not using them to push yourself forward, if you can just use to hold, like a little kickstand, while you readjust, that could
so
be...
you don't roll downhill.
Exactly. Like that, just having that little bit of grippage could maybe help you, get up an incline or something.
Yeah. And then there is the other aspect that a lot of legless lizards use their hind legs in mating or competition.
Yes.
Snakes are well known for this. So in boas and pythons and a handful of other early diverging branches of snakes, they have remnants of the hind limbs that protrude as little claws outside of the body. These are often called spurs, pelvic spurs. These tend to be larger in males than in females, and they seem to be used for competition. Two pythons, males that are fighting each other, will like scrape at each other with these little spurs, but also they'll use it to hold on and position themselves during mating. So kind of similar to the way that a shark uses its claspers to get the position with the other shark that it's mating with. This is also suspected to be the case with lots of legless lizards. In fact, this might be one of the main reasons why the hind limbs are held onto more often than the front limbs. Dibamids, those blind skinks that aren't skinks, actually have a condition where females tend to be essentially limbless, but males retain flap-like hind legs.
Yeah.
So these are limbs that have clearly been reduced in their function, but aren't functionless and are still performing important enough tasks that there's sexual dimorphism within legless lizards, snakes included.
Yeah, and it totally makes sense because we've talked about before that when you get a weird body shape like that, it can make certain things difficult. And if you are now mating is an extremely important step, so having a little bit of aid in holding on or positioning or whatever it is, totally makes sense that that would be enough to go. All right, well we're keeping these back legs because they're not
Yeah.
getting in the way enough, and they sure come in handy when the time is important.
And they're clearly not necessary because there are groups of lizards, including snakes, that have lost them completely and aren't using them for anything. But it seems like there is still a function that is beneficial enough to hold on to it.
And I don't know enough about how snakes or the fully legless lizards, when they mate, I don't know how much I I don't know what specializations there might be to aid in coupling.
Yeah.
Where it's like we've talked about this with like sharks, which are internally fertilizing fish, which is unusual for fish, and they have to have specializations of the clasper and usually biting onto their
Mm-hmm.
partner to hold on, because now you need to orient yourselves to each other instead of just laying eggs and broadcast fertilizing. So I wonder if there are any specializations in the genitalia of the fully legless versions that it's like, yeah, this is to help with the fact that it's hard to hold on to each other.
Yeah. I also, and this is a little bit more vague because this is going off of my memory, but I feel like snakes and some of the other like amphisbaenians, the really committed legless lizard groups, are often more flexible
Yes.
than the other ones. Like snakes can coil up very tightly in ways that I don't think most legless lizards can do. So that flexibility might also help to overcome any difficulties with mating positioning.
Yeah,
That
like
you can hold on with the body basically.
exactly, like a lot of snakes, either for competition, but I do think there's ones where this happens during mating, will twine around each other, twist
Yeah.
around each other. And so, yeah, if you can effectively tie yourselves into knots to hold on to stuff, then that might solve everything. But if you're a relatively stiff, long bodied animal, that's not that flexible, maybe having
Yep.
some little helping hands is going to make a big difference for you.
Yes. This also might be related to why snakes are so good in the trees. That
Yes.
flexibility, that ability to wrap and grip with the body.
That I was thinking the same thing, that when I think of legless lizards, I don't think of them being that flexible. And if you're mostly tail, I wonder if it's like that's helpful if you have like having a long prehensile tail is good if you have limbs to climb with, but unless your body is also that prehensile, then you can't just climb with your tail. You need the whole body to be that way or something.
Yeah. Interesting. I have nothing more to say on that for this episode. I do want to mention, if briefly, fossil fossil legless lizards. We do have fossils of legless lizards. Now, this does raise the interesting question of if you find a fossil, how do you know, unless you have the entire skeleton, if it was legless? Even if you do have the entire skeleton, how do you know if the limbs just didn't fossilize?
Yes.
And the short and simple answer most of the time is that most limbless lizard fossils are identified as limbless because they belong to the groups that today are legless lizards.
Yes.
One of the things that is really interesting about leglessness across lizards is this has evolved over and over again, body shape, limb shape has evolved convergently, but skull shape tends to be highly specific to different groups. So
Oh.
the overall shape of the skull, like in some of the burrowers for pushing through sediment, might be convergent, but the actual detailed features of the skull remain specific to different groups. A skink skull looks like a skink skull, even if the body is snake shaped. So if you have skull material, skulls and sometimes vertebrae can be useful for identifying this belongs to this group of animals, and that's a legless group of animals. And so these are legless lizards. Some groups do not have a fossil record, though a lot of the single genus groups, like Chamaesora, the grass lizards, Ophiodes, the gallywasps, limbless gallywasps, as far as I can tell, don't have a fossil record.
Bummer.
Most of the others have like scraps of a fossil record. There are fossil pygopods, the limbless geckos. There are some jaws found in Holocene caves, so, the last several thousand years. And there is, as far as I could find, a single lower jawbone from the Miocene of Riversley in Australia that belongs to an extinct species, Pygopus horchinalis, which appears to be the only bone of the only known extinct species of pygopod geckos. Very similar with the dibamids, the blind skinks that aren't skinks. There is one known extinct species from jaw material in the Oligocene of Mongolia. That's Hecasaurus mongoliensis. Very limited fossil remains. We've got that one.
Huh.
On the other hand, there are some groups that have surprisingly good fossil records. The American legless lizards, despite being a single genus that is only in California, has lots of fossils.
Cool.
Aniella is known from fossils in California from the Miocene, Pliocene, and Pleistocene, including at least a couple from the La Brea tar pits. These are mostly individual jaws and vertebrae and osteoderms, the bony armor in the skin. There is one possible relative, Apodosauriscus, which is known from jaws all the way back in the Eocene and in Wyoming, so significantly older and not in California, that is thought to be closely related to the American legless lizards, which might be a hint at their extended origins, but we have that one specimen. I did not know that American legless lizards had a good fossil record. That's wild to me. They live in a single corner of a country. That's extremely strange. The other group that I'll mention for now that has a really good fossil record that I knew had a really good fossil record are glass lizards.
Yes.
Anguinae, the glass lizards of the type that we have here. This is a group that today is found in North America, Europe, and Asia. There are lots of fossils across North America, Europe, and Asia. We have some at the Gray Fossil Site, for example. These are known all the way back to the Eocene, 40 to 50 million years ago. Anguin fossil remains tend to be, like the American legless lizards, skull bits, vertebrae, and osteoderms. We have at least 2 of those, I think, at the Gray Fossil Site. This group includes multiple, not only extinct species, but extinct genera. There is a substantial fossil assemblage for these animals. These also include, so whereas the American legless lizards are mostly found all in the same place that they are today, the glass lizard fossil record is good enough that we can see some trends and changes over their evolutionary history. For example, today there is one species of glass lizard that lives across Europe and Asia. They are in Europe they're called European legless lizards. They're also called Sheltopusic. This is the genus Pseudopus. These are also large, like they get over a meter long.
Oh, wow, cool.
But in the fossil record, there are several other species across Europe and Asia since the Miocene. This seems to be a group that was formerly more diverse in this part of the world and has since been reduced down to the one that we have today. That ancient diversity also includes the largest known member of this group, Pseudopus panonicus, which had a skull up to 10 centimeters long, which is very long for a legless lizard. Legless lizards tend not to get that big.
Yeah, no, I mean that's decent.
I think that the biggest legless lizards outside of snakes are like a meter and a half, like a meter and a half long, a few feet. Most legless lizards are extremely small.
Yes.
Another cool note from the fossil record of glass lizards: modern anguines are all limbless, but fossil anguines are not all limbless.
Oh.
There is a partial skeleton of the genus Ophisaurus, which is the same genus as the glass lizards that live in our part of the world today. This one comes from the Miocene of Germany and has preserved pelvic bones. And the shape of those pelvic bones, compared with modern lizards, suggests that this ancient glass lizard probably had small but functional hind legs.
Okay.
This is one of the ways that we can get an idea of if an ancient lizard was legless. If we have pelvic bones, those can give us a clue as to were these the shape we would expect to be supporting small legs. And it looks like we do have less legless ancient glass lizard. It sounds like there's at least 2 specimens of fossil glass lizards that have pelvic bones preserved that are thought to have supported small hind legs, which is very cool.
That's awesome. And yeah, I was wondering if we would get pelvic material, because that is a solid bit of bone that I could expect preserving.
Yeah, and most legless lizards have retained pelvic bones.
Yeah.
Like kind of like whales.
Yes.
Right? Like if you look at a whale skeleton, there's still pelvic bones in there. They're not really using them for much. Most legless lizards have not completely lost the pelvic girdle. And I think those specimens were mostly complete skeletons, which we don't typically get. In fact, I think that of all of the lizard groups that I listed in that fossil exploration, I think that might be the only example of a partially complete skeleton. They are almost always just bits and pieces.
Very cool.
Very similar to snakes. Most fossil legless lizards are identified from vertebrae because that's what most of the body is, except the ones that have the good decency to be covered in armor, because then osteoderms preserve extremely well. That's the best way to identify that you had glass lizards, is to find their osteoderms.
Yeah, which totally makes sense, because like backbones, there's a bunch of them, but unlike those, they're very simple and just tough bone.
Yep, that's their job. Their job is to be sturdy.
You're just a little bony plate, so you're tough, and there's not a bunch of like delicate features to get worn away typically. Like it's usually just a little bump of bone, and that can preserve real well.
Yeah, glass lizard osteoderms are very distinctive too. They tend to be rectangular, and they have kind of a keel down the center. They're very identifiable.
I have a mental image from doing the picking at Grey Foss, at the Grey Foss site, and always getting excited when I found what looked like it might be like lizard osteoderm.
Yeah, they are cool looking. They're very cool looking osteoderms. So we've gone over a bunch of the diversity of lifestyles and anatomy, and even some of the fossil record of legless lizards. We're going to take a break, and then in the second part of our discussion, what I'm going to do is give us a deeper dive on the 2 groups that have hit it the biggest in the legless lizard shape. We will talk about amphisbaenians, because they are extremely cool and weird, and we will talk about snakes. Stay tuned. So I mentioned before that the 2 groups of legless lizards that have really become very successful up to the modern day are snakes, obviously as the reigning champions, and amphisbaenians. Amphisbaenia is a group of lizards that are called worm lizards. Not only are they quite diverse, but also like snakes, they are highly specialized. There are, as I mentioned before, more than 200 living species that have been identified. They are all across there in North America and South America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. They are nearly all specialized burrowers. This is, I made this comment before, amphisbaenians are extremely common and successful and diverse and very rarely seen because they are subterranean animals. They spend most of their time underground. They are, like most lizards, carnivorous. They're eating worms and bugs and other invertebrates and stuff. Amphisbaenians have long bodies, short and blunt tails, like a lot of other burrowing lizards, highly reduced legs, and uniquely, their scales form rings down the length of the body, so they look kind of like earthworms.
Yes, very
And
much
I've
so.
seen it described that those rings might help them to move their body in a similar way as earthworms do. One source that I looked at suggested that amphisbaenians can kind of slither forward in a similar way to snakes or worms. This is part of that that specialization in the body. They also have extremely specialized skulls. Amphisbaenian skulls are highly fused. They are often either rounded or pointy for pushing their way through the sediment. Legless lizards when they do burrow, they tend to burrow by pushing through with their face. Amphisbaenians also have large teeth, despite having like strange fused skulls. Amphisbaenian skulls look more like xenomorph heads than most animals manage to accomplish. They look very strange.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They're very bullet shaped almost.
Yes, and they have a lot in common with Sicilians. They have a similar, like, odd, compact, a skull that doesn't look the way that vertebrate skulls normally look because they are specialized for doing a thing that most vertebrates don't do. Amphisbaenians also have very reduced eyes. They also have reduced hearing. I believe it is a common feature of amphisbaenians that they've lost the eardrum. This is another thing that we see in a bunch of other burrowing animals, that the hearing has been reduced. Amphisbaenians tend to be extremely small. Most of them, you could easily confuse them for worms, kind of like a lot of worm burrowing snakes. The largest living species is a South American species, Amphisbaena alba, which can be up to 80 centimeters long, so almost 3 feet long, which is quite large not only for amphisbaenians, but just for legless lizards in general. That is a pretty big lizard. For a very long time, there was lots of back and forth and arguing about where amphisbaenians fit in the lizard family tree, who they're related to, and what ancestors they share with other groups. I believe that at times in the past, it was thought that they might be outside of the rest of lizards, or that they might be closest related to snakes. Recent studies have suggested that they are most closely related to the family Lacertidae, which are wall lizards, and their relatives. Amphisbaenians, I mentioned this before, they are so specialized and unusual that even though they are within the lizard family tree, they are often referred to separately. So a lot of times I will see, even in a scientific literature, squamates referred to as lizards, snakes, and amphisbaenians.
Yeah.
Even though those are all lizards. That is triple redundancy. But snakes are unusual. They get their own name. Amphisbaenians are often elevated to that same etymological uniqueness.
That's so cool.
Most amphisbaenians are nearly completely limbless. It's not uncommon for them to have pelvic remains, sometimes pectoral muscles, like the musculature of the pectoral girdle is still there, even though the arms are gone, with one famous and notable exception, and that is the genus Bipes.
Yep.
Bipes, who we have mentioned on the podcast before because it's so unusual and standout. Bipes is a genus with 3 species that live in Mexico, the most common and well-known of which is the Mexican mole lizard. Bipes retains the front limbs, but not just like has some front limbs, has small but well developed with several fingers, front arms, and no back legs.
Yeah.
Bipes looks so weird because it has these arms and they're really far up on the body. Like Bipe doesn't really have a neck very much. So it's head and then right behind the head, two beefy little arms, and then like many centimeters of worm-like body
Yes.
that is just dragging along behind it. It is a very unusual looking creature.
Well, and it's funny because, and I was thinking about this in the first part, that so many of the legless lizards are fossorial or burrowing and have reduced their limbs to be better at that, while the mammal route to be a burrower is typically to have more robust limbs.
Yes, like moles or armadillos.
Exactly. And then bipes came along and it was like, ¿por qué no los dos?
Yes. Bipes, those front arms are for digging. They have mole-like hands. So whereas most burrowing lizards, like you mentioned, are pushing with the face, Bipes actually digs with those hands. The three different species of Bipes seem to be distinguished in part by the number of fingers they have.
Oh,
3, 4, or 5.
okay.
I think the common species, which I think is Bipes bicolor, has 5 fingers, which is just a full lizard hand.
Yes.
That's as many fingers as you get as a lizard. So they have retained these way far up digging limbs, which is extremely unusual for legless lizards.
Cool.
Bipes is also adorable.
It's so goofy looking.
It's like a weird, it's like that perfect middle point of adorable and creepy.
Yes.
Bipes looks like a toy you'd buy at like a Hot Topic. Like a little creepy, an adorable creepy weirdo.
It looks it to give a mental image for people. If any of you are familiar with Wormy from Sesame Street, it's got a little wormy face, but if Wormy had 2 little buff arms.
Yes.
And that's very much what they look like. And like close-ups make them look way creepier until you actually see how actually quite small they are.
They're long, but they're very small.
Yeah, they're thin. And so yeah, it's just this little guy.
And again, this is one of those, like I mentioned, there are some groups of lizards that have one little batch of species that are doing the legless thing. Amphisbaenians are a diverse group of legless lizards, and Bipes is one little batch that is doing this 4-limb digging thing, which is very unusual. Another surprising and exciting thing that is true about Amphisbaenians is that they have a really good fossil record.
Oh.
Amphisbaenians are known. There are several extinct species known, mainly in Europe and North America. There are, if I remember correctly, I think there's 6 living families within the Amphisbaenian group. And I think 5 of them have at least one fossil species that has been identified. There is also at least one extinct species that is only known from fossils. Most of these are known from vertebrae and bits of the skull. The skull is extremely distinctive in Amphisbaenians, so if you find skull bits, it's often not difficult to identify it to the group. Most of these fossils are also quite old. They tend to be most common in the Paleocene and the Eocene, so 40 to 60 million years ago, which seems to be the heyday of Amphisbaenians, I suppose. One family in particular is mostly fossils. Rhinuridae is a family that's still around today. There is one species of this family, Rhinura floridana, the Florida worm lizard, which is found in Florida and also in Georgia. These are, these are pretty typical. They're tiny, they're burrowing, you never see them. The family Rhinuridae has several fossil genera. There's way more fossils of this group than there are the one living species. They're found all across North America. Again, most abundant in the Eocene and then in the Oligocene. So amphisbaenians have a surprisingly complete and well-represented fossil record, especially here in North America. Included in that fossil record, there is also a giant amphisbaenian,
Woo!
or to be more accurate, the largest amphisbaenian. It is not, I mean, it's giant, but it's not that much more giant than our modern giant amphisbaenians.
Humongous.
It's a graboid. This is
Mhm.
Pterastiodontosaurus from the Eocene of Tunisia, known from skull fragments and some vertebrae. The skull is around 5 centimeters long. It has powerful jaws, and the paper that I read about it said that it was probably eating snails or other like hard-shelled invertebrates and crushing them in its tiny monstrous jaws.
Cool.
Pterastiodontosaurus might have been almost a full meter long, which would make it a little bit longer than the modern biggest species of amphisbaenians we have now. And the largest amphisbaenian would also make it among the largest legless lizards that we know of.
Very nice.
But again, large in this case being kind of long is really more of what it is.
Yes.
Most of the amphisbaenian fossil record is amphisbaenians. We don't have very much in the way of the ancestors of this group. There is one well-studied fossil that is thought to be the oldest amphisbaenian. It is the genus Slavoia from the Cretaceous, the late Cretaceous of Mongolia and Kazakhstan. It is the oldest member of this group and thought to be possibly an ancestor or cousin of amphisbaenians. It is known from several specimens. So researchers have identified a bunch of amphisbaenian features in it, including the relatively long body, the compact skull, the big teeth, the adaptations for burrowing lifestyles. It also has 4 small limbs.
Okay.
Slavoia does not look very much like modern amphisbaenians. Like, it looks like a lizard. It's got 4 limbs. The body is long, but it's not that long. So it might be a image of what the ancestors of amphisbaenians looked like. And as you know, from my sort of cursorial review of it, it looks kind of like what you'd expect the ancestor of amphisbaenians to look like. It looks like a lot of skinks look. Right?
Yeah.
A little bit longer, somewhat reduced legs, adapted for burrowing around, has some of those skull features showing up, but had not quite yet achieved full worm lizard like amphisbaenians we're familiar with.
Cool.
There is also one other fossil lizard that comes up in discussions of amphisbaenians. This is a lizard from the Messelpit, Eocene, Germany, called Cryptolacerta, which is another nearly complete skeleton, because Messelpit. It has some degree of long body and short legs. Based on the skull, it has variously been placed either as a relative of amphisbaenians or a relative of lacertids, the close cousins of amphisbaenians. So it might be an early relative. It might be part of an early branch that was related to those two groups. But interestingly, the fact that it is somewhat long-bodied and somewhat short-limbed might be a lingering body form from earlier in the evolution of these groups.
Yeah.
Because amphisbaenians are snake-shaped, but lacertids are not. So it might be that it could be that this is a separate development of that body shape, but it could also be a lingering intermediate sort of form that persisted all the way until the Eocene.
Interesting.
So amphisbaenians are a very, very interesting, very unusual group of animals. One of those groups that has what I would consider a surprisingly good fossil record, especially
Yeah.
considering how rare fossils tend to be of these groups of legless lizards.
That was exactly what I was just thinking about. Is it is very intriguing that their fossil record is so robust, and makes me wonder how much of it has to do with the fact that they are burrowing animals almost entirely. And if you're already underground, it's a great place to be fossilized.
Yes. Well, they're also very reinforced, right?
And
The
that's the other
skulls
thing.
are very dense. The vertebrae survive quite well.
Yeah, that was the other thing is you mentioned skulls much more often than you did with any of the other groups. And yeah, having a little helmet head probably helps it survive much better. So it's
Yes.
interesting that not only are they a very standout group today, but that those features may be why we have a much better understanding of their fossil record. Is very
Absolutely.
cool.
Amphisbaenians, as I mentioned, are arguably the second most successful attempt at legless lizard. The most successful attempt at legless lizards are snakes. Snakes, like amphisbaenians, are extremely specialized. They have a lot of unique features. A lot of these are in the skull, whereas amphisbaenians have these very compact, rigid skulls for burrowing. Snake skulls are extremely mobile, they're highly kinetic. They have a lot of adaptations and anatomical features that allows for flexibility in the skull that also make them distinct from other lizards. I'm not going to talk a ton about snakes and their history here because we've talked about a lot of this on other episodes of the podcast, but putting them now in the context of legless lizards as a trend, snakes tend to have short tails,
Hmm.
although that varies because, like tree dwelling snakes will have somewhat longer tails, but for the most part, snakes tend to be, and as far I'm pretty sure across the board, snakes have long bodies
Yeah.
and relatively short tails. They also maybe kind of have long necks, which isn't a feature that we see very commonly across legless lizards. Now, it's hard to say if snakes have a long neck because they don't have front limbs,
Yes.
but they do. There has been some discussion in the literature of whether or not snakes count as having elongated necks as well as bodies and tails.
Oh, I always thought that they were. It was pretty set that they had short necks. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, they don't have like very long necks in the same way that they don't have very long tails,
Yes,
but most lizards don't have long. Most lizards have fairly short necks.
absolutely.
And snakes, again, yes, the snake neck kind of grades right into the torso, but snakes do seem to have a more long neck region than a lot of other lizards do.
Cool.
This will come up again in just a little bit. Snakes, as I mentioned before, have no vestige of their pectoral girdle. This apparently is something that they lost right at the base of the group, way early on. Hind limbs are sometimes there's vestiges. The back legs of snakes seem to have probably been lost multiple times over the whole group. And snakes are, as we were sort of hinting at before, in addition to being more speciose and more widespread than other groups of legless lizards, they also do a bunch of things that other groups don't do.
Hmm.
Again, most snakes are ground dwelling or burrowing. So most snakes are fitting this legless lizard archetype, but there are also tree dwelling snakes. Some of them are specialized tree dwellers, a lot of, like boas and pythons that spend their lives up in trees. There are a lot of snakes that are aquatic. There are freshwater snakes that hunt in the water, and then there are, of course, sea snakes. Snakes also, another thing that they do that other legless lizards don't do is that snakes get gigantic.
Yeah.
Typical snakes, like 90% of snakes, are in the same general size range as most legless lizards, but many groups can reach 2 meters or more long, and we have had multiple groups that have evolved truly gigantic sizes. We talked about that in episode 196, boas and pythons and other giant snakes. So snakes, not only have they managed to expand the repertoire of legless lizards, they've also been doing this for like 100 million years.
Yeah.
Snakes have been this diverse since the Cretaceous period.
Which is very interesting to see comparing them to all the groups we've been talking about this episode.
Yes. This is the thing that I've been harping on about snakes for years, is that snakes are so... this episode, I didn't plan for this episode to be a long buildup to, no, but really, snakes are super exciting and cool and different, but it has turned out to be that way. Snakes are supreme outliers among limbless lizards.
I mean, it is a really good demonstration of not only are snakes super diverse for a legless group compared to just other vertebrates, compared to other reptiles or other or mammals, but even compared to other legless vertebrates, they are doing something that none of those other groups have seemed to ever do, and that's really notable.
Yeah. These days, snakes are, again, so different from other lizards that we call them something different. But back in the Mesozoic era, we can really study snakes like as legless lizards because we have a lot of older snake fossils with more remnants of legs. The oldest fossil snakes, the absolute oldest known snakes, go back as far as the mid-Jurassic. These include the genera Parviraptor and Diablophus. These are only known from vertebrae, which doesn't give us a lot to go on, but it has been noted that included among those vertebrae are what might be hip vertebrae, sacral vertebrae, which modern snakes do not have.
Mm-hmm.
And these are fairly robust potential sacral vertebrae, which might suggest that these oldest snakes had a pelvic girdle and potentially functional hind limbs. Later on in the fossil record, we have more complete remains. Snakes have, I mentioned legless lizards tend not to have a good fossil record. Snakes have an extraordinary fossil record. And a big part of that is just because they've been everywhere and they are incredibly numerous and diverse.
There's no escaping them.
You can't get away. In the late Cretaceous, we have lots of limbed snakes. We've talked about a bunch of these before, so I'll do a relatively quick review, focusing in on some of those limb qualities. Nahash, from the late Cretaceous of Argentina, was a land-dwelling snake that has small but well-formed hind limbs and has a pair of sacral vertebrae.
Okay.
I believe that Nahash and then maybe those earlier ones are the only known examples of sacral vertebrae in snakes, those hip vertebrae. And then, very famously, there is a whole variety of marine snakes in the ancient Tethys Sea in the Cretaceous. Several species, all found in limestones and other marine sediments, with side-to-side compressed bodies, so narrow and tall bodies, dense bones, features that we see in sea snakes and other animals that live in the water. And a few of these are known from complete specimens that show small hind limbs.
For kicking.
These hind limbs are also variable, like they are in a lot of modern reduced-legged lizards. Haseophis, for example, has a reduced number of digits. I think it's got like 3 or 4 digits on those back legs, whereas Eupodophis, another one of them, has no digits. So there's variation in the amount of limb reduction in these ancient sea snakes. And then there's a bunch of other specimens that aren't complete enough to tell if they had hind limbs or not, but seem to be very closely related to those other marine snakes and probably had hind limbs. So there was this whole radiation of ocean-dwelling hind-legged snakes in the Tethys Sea of the Cretaceous.
Which is so cool.
Eventually, of course, all snakes lost any sort of functional hind legs, leaving only those pelvic spurs behind in some groups. These have also been interpreted for some ancient snakes. So we've talked before about the Madsoids, which are a very ancient group of boa and python-like snakes. Wonambi, which is a Madsoid from Australia, very young compared to most other fossil snakes, has elements preserved of the pelvis, and researchers have noted that Wonambi's pelvis has a socket, the hip socket, where the femur would attach, that seems to be developed enough that it probably had some amount of leg back there. So Madsoid snakes probably had pelvic spurs similar to boas and pythons.
Yeah, that's what I've always been wondering. What if we find any sort of pelvis? If it's like, yeah, but if there's a pocket for a bone, something was fitting into that pocket.
Something was in that pocket. Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head if we have fossilized pelvic spurs of fossil boas and pythons. I feel like maybe we do. I feel like I
Yeah.
maybe have encountered that. But yeah,
So-
those bones are so reduced and small.
Yes.
Here's how reduced and small and unlikely to be preserved those bones are. My friend Steve and I dissected a boa constrictor, the actual, just the body of a boa constrictor, and we only found one
Yep.
of those hind limbs. We missed the other one, which was in there somewhere, did not find it. So like that's even in the modern, like actually physically digging through the body of a snake, it is hard to find those pelvic spurs.
They are itty bitty tiny. Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is we don't fully know which limb elements they are because they're so reduced and have lost so much of their features.
Yeah, I think it is most often referred to as the femur.
Cool.
That is supporting those bones. But there are multiple bones in there.
Yes.
And I know there has at least been some debate over what bones are these actually representing? Because there's at a certain point, hip bones and femur become so unlike hip bones and femur that it becomes hard to say if this is for sure what those bones are.
Well, and especially in a situation where it is not a consistently survival critical element. So like when we talked about this in a news that was about, I think, the wing reduction, and that you start to see a lot of asymmetry in wings when they get reduced, because it doesn't matter if your wings are a little wonky because you're not using them to fly. It's same thing here. You just get kind of just little knobbly bone pieces that do the job they need to do, but they don't need specific structures.
Yes. And that has also, I've seen that noted for legless lizards, that the reduced legs tend to end up with asymmetries.
Yeah.
Because the specific structure isn't as important. It doesn't have to be as reliable.
Neat.
Now, the big debate in snake evolutionary study is the question of how snakes got started. And again, we've talked about this before, but in the context of legless lizards, snakes presumably started out as fairly normal legless lizards, like a lot of these other groups that we have today. But exactly what they were doing and why they adopted this form originally has been debated. The debate has classically come down to two major options: a burrowing ancestry or an aquatic ancestry.
Yes.
Now, burrowing makes a lot of intuitive sense because, as we pointed out, that is what most legless lizards are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're not burrowing, they're close to burrowing. In fact, it is extremely uncommon for legless lizards outside of snakes to be swimmers. Off the top of my head, I don't know of any. I'm sure they can swim, but I don't know of any legless lizards that are particularly associated with moving through aquatic habitats.
Now I really want to see video of them swimming to see.
They probably can.
Yeah, like I assume you can, because like we've pointed out many times, most animal life can swim. That is kind of the default. But do you swim like a snake, or does it look different?
Oh yeah, that'd be interesting. The burrowing hypothesis has also received additional support from looking at features of fossil snakes, genetic reconstructions, genetic traits, like snakes have reduced genes controlling vision, which is something we see a lot in birds. So there's a lot of support, especially recently, for the idea of snakes having a burrowing ancestor. The aquatic hypothesis these days is less favored. It seems like it's falling more out of favor But one of the biggest reasons why the aquatic origins hypothesis stuck around and why it is also a compelling hypothesis is because snakes have a bunch of aquatic relatives.
Yes.
And many of those relatives are some of the only examples we have of extinct groups of legless lizards, which is very cool. Snakes are very closely related to mosasaurs, which were whale lizards. They were fully marine, swimming out in the open ocean lizards. Mosasaurs are interesting because they do have long bodies, right? They have long tails, they are elongated, but they're not really limb reduced the way that we think of with a lot of lizards today. Mosasaurs actually have pretty robust legs.
Yeah.
And they've been adapted, so their shape has changed, but they're more modified limbs than they are reduced limbs. In all of my reading, I never saw mosasaurs referred to as limb reduced lizards.
Well, it's to me, I think of a similar comparison would be like bird wings, where a bird's wing bone is shorter than the front limb bones of many other animals.
Yeah,
Like,
and they have fewer digits.
and they have fewer digits. But that is an extremely specialized and still very robust limb because it's doing a very specific job, just like the flippers of a mosasaur or the front flippers of a whale, where it's like,
Yep.
yeah, they may be shorter, so there may be less limb there than if this were a walking version of a mosasaur, what their walking ancestors, but it's doing work. It is critical to their survival and mobility.
They're more like just something like a sea lion.
Yeah.
You still have limbs and you're still using them. They're not really reduced in the way that we think of.
Just reformatted.
But there are a bunch of other fossil species that are in the snake mosasaur spectrum that are thought to be either very close to snakes or maybe closer to mosasaurs, but they're in that early family tree, many of which are long-bodied, limb-reduced lizards. For example, two really common, well-studied examples are Adriosaurus and Dolichosaurus, both of which are from Europe from the late Cretaceous. Both of them are long-bodied with long necks, and distinctly they have long necks because they also have a pectoral girdle. We can see very clearly they have long necks.
Neat.
Both of them have reduced limbs. In both, the front limbs are more reduced than the back legs. Makes a lot of sense. In both, the scapula and coracoid, the elements of the shoulder, are small and unfused. In Adriosaurus, the front limbs end at the humerus. So the humerus is like, I think, if I remember correctly, Adriosaurus, the humerus tapers at the end. So its upper arm bone is kind of like a spike. And then there's nothing beyond that.
Huh, they just got little toothpicks.
Both of these are marine. They have compressed bodies, they have dense bones, they're found in ocean sediments like a lot of those ancient sea snakes, and indeed living alongside those ancient sea snakes. These are Mesozoic, long-bodied, short-limbed lizards. In fact, they are, like I said, some of the only examples of fully extinct groups of these snake-shaped lizards. Those are two. There's a bunch of others. Some of them have complete enough preserved skeletons to see the long bodies and the reduced legs. Like we see in lizards today, there's various degrees of how reduced those legs are. Some of them are thought to have possibly still been capable of moving on land based on how sturdy those back legs were. There's one, at least one, from Japan, Kaganaias, which was found not in marine sediments, but in swamp deposits, and might have been a freshwater swimming snake-shaped lizard.
Cool.
Which is very cool. These all go back to about 100 million years ago. So during the late Cretaceous, there were maybe the earliest representatives of of your amphisbaenians, right? Or close to amphisbaenians. but mostly it was this diversity of snake-like lizards. The limbless lizard shape was represented by snakes and their seemingly all aquatic cousins.
Huh.
Whether or not these are representative of the ancestry of snakes is debated. Sometimes they're considered to be close relatives to snakes. Other times, some of them are considered to be closer to mosasaurs. It's also entirely possible that even if they are closely related to snakes, they might be different from what their ancestors were, and that it was just something that snakes and their cousins did a bunch, was move into the water. But the fact remains, snakes included, in the Cretaceous, there were a bunch of long-bodied, short-limbed lizards who were aquatic, who were marine, which is something we don't see in legless lizards very much today.
Yeah, which is very intriguing that we saw multiple groups do it, but not today. This is not now another on the long list of I'm really butthurt we don't have these, because that sounds awesome.
I'm wondering if legless lizards since the Cretaceous haven't occupied these aquatic or arboreal spaces because snakes have been around.
Yes, then
Like
that was
this,
what I was thinking.
this was something that I noticed in one of my many papers that I read about skinks, that legless skinks are all over the world. Skinks are everywhere. You can't not find skinks. But legless skinks are almost unheard of in the Americas.
Yeah.
There is, I think, one. I think we have one limbless skink species or limb-reduced skink species here in North America. All of the others are Europe, Asia, they're old world. And it was suggested that possibly one of the reasons why there aren't legless skinks here in the Americas is because we have the American legless lizards, and we have glass lizards, and we have gymnophthalmids. We have these other groups that are occupying those niches, and skinks might just have never gotten a foothold is the wrong word, but never gotten into those spaces. So I do wonder how because snakes are also, all of these ancient legless marine snake-like creatures predate the fossil records of all of the other legless lizard groups that we have.
Yep.
Now, most of them don't have a very good fossil record. So, it exactly how reliable that is. But they also, a lot of them are more recent evolutions. So this is something that genetic estimates have predicted, that a lot of these aren't as ancient divergences. Amphisbaenians seem to have gotten started really early, and dibamids might have gotten started really early. But it seems like it was really snakes and their cousins, the pythonomorphs, sometimes that whole group is called, were doing it before these other groups showed up. So I do wonder how much the existence of snakes altered and affected the evolution of all other groups of legless lizards.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it would also make sense since the only other group of legless lizard to become notably numerous and diverse are ones that are super specialized to living like worms underground. And like there are snakes that live that way. Worm snakes are blind snakes are super successful. Just people don't usually hear about them for the same reason that they don't usually hear about amphisbaenians. But it would make sense that even if becoming a legless lizard is a very common thing, it's hard to really break out being a legless lizard because you're gonna be competing with snakes in one way or another.
Yeah. I also wonder, this is conjecture, and I don't know if this works, but there are also a lot of snakes that eat lizards.
Yeah.
So I feel like evolving into a position where you're competing directly against snakes not only puts you at risk for being outcompeted, but also snakes will eat lizards.
Yeah.
So maybe you don't want to be in the trees. Maybe maybe it's better for you to just stay out of there and stay where it's safe.
Well, yeah, and like if you can specialize more in going after like the small underbrush and subterranean prey, bugs and worms and snails and stuff, which there are snakes that eat those things, but snakes
Sure.
are specialized to be able to swallow relatively large prey to, compared to them whole. Maybe you don't compete as much if it's like, oh, I'm just going to eat this cricket. Like,
Right. Well, and most legless lizards are living in niches that are very similar to what limbed lizards do. Right.
yes,
Running around on the ground, crawling underground. There are lizards with legs and short bodies that do all those things.
yes.
So it isn't, for the most part, much of a shift. You're still in a very similar lizardy ecological niche, with exceptions like the dibamids and amphisbaenians who have gone full burrowing specialized.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a fascinating trend in the evolutionary history of squamates.
Well, and then it makes that question of, did snakes start out aquatic or subterranean, all the more weird, because based off the whole episode, we've been talking about how common fossorial behavior is with legless lizards of all different kinds. So it would make sense that the most successful group of legless lizards also started that way, but maybe they are the weird standout group. And one of the reasons is because they didn't start out that way. They started out aquatically, and that led to some of the things that made snakes snakes.
Yeah. So, in conclusion, snakes are the best.
It's
Once
yeah,
again,
that like
this has been that's it. Now, 2 hours into this discussion, this is what it's all been coming to: is snakes are extremely cool, even among legless lizards.
Yeah, they really are just the star players of legless lizards in so many different ways. It's pretty awesome.
Listeners, if you want to learn more about legless lizards and see pictures, I'm going to put together a whole bunch of pictures of different legless lizard groups in the blog post. Check it out. There will be at least one picture of Mexican mole lizards because they are so weird and adorable.
Mm.
Before we wrap everything up, there is one more thing to do, and that is to answer some patron questions. One of the benefits that our patrons can receive in return for their support of us on Patreon is the ability to submit questions for us to answer here on the podcast. I picked 2 this episode that are thematically appropriate. Will, what do we got?
Our first question is from Maui, who says, I am not aware of any non-carnivorous squamates. Is there or has there ever been one? Do we know why they have not or rarely evolved away from carnivorous behavior?
This is an excellent question. Squamates, so lizards and everything underneath the lizard umbrella, tend to be carnivores.
Mm-hmm.
They are not often herbivorous. There are herbivorous lizards.
Yes.
There are a bunch of omnivorous lizards, and then there are some dedicated herbivores. But it is very rare. One paper that I read about this explained that less than 2% of lizards species are herbivores.
Wow.
It is not a thing that happens very much. There are a bunch of lizards that are omnivores, and they will often eat easy plant material like fruits and flowers in addition to bugs or whatever else they're eating. But there are some strict herbivores. Usually these are leaf eaters that have specialized teeth and specialized in digestive tracts for being herbivorous. Most of these are iguanas.
Yes.
Iguanas and their close cousins have evolved herbivory far more times than all the other parts of the lizard family tree. There is a group of iguanian lizards in South America called leolemids, which are extremely, for lizards, commonly herbivorous. There are also, outside of the iguanians, there are a couple of monitor lizard species that are thought to be mostly herbivorous. There's at least one fruit-eating monitor species and at least one that is thought to be mostly eating plants.
Cool.
And there are also a couple of fossil lizards, particularly large fossil lizards, not like gigantic, but a bit larger, that seem to be adapted for plant eating, that have been interpreted as possibly filling a role similar to things like rabbits or slightly larger herbivorous mammals.
Yeah.
So herbivory isn't unheard of across lizards. It is unheard of in snakes.
Yes.
Snakes do not take in plants. And as to the question of why they don't become herbivorous more, is probably it's just hard.
Mhm.
You know, snakes and amphisbaenians are two great examples. They are both so specialized, especially in the skull and their lifestyle and their teeth, that, you know, in order to be, you can't just up and one day decide to start eating plants. Most of the time when herbivory evolves from carnivores, episode 173, it goes through an omnivorous stage.
Yes.
And it's hard to imagine how snakes would achieve omnivory because they are just so specialized for taking in prey. Amphisbaenians are very similar. I wouldn't be surprised if it's just something about lizard jaws or teeth or digestive system just makes it difficult for them to successfully become omnivores, and therefore very difficult for them to transition into being herbivores.
Well, and with snakes, it brings up the question of like, how would they, would they swallow fruit whole? They don't have jaws and teeth that are very good for taking on foliage. And if you want to really digest plants, you need like a big gut, which feels like it wouldn't fit well with their long, slim bodies. So, yeah.
So yeah. So I don't know of a specific reason why lizards don't eat plants more often, but my guess is that it's something like that. That
Yeah.
it's a harder thing. I mean, reptiles in general are often not strict herbivores, right?
Yeah.
Most turtles, crocs, it's just not a thing that modern reptiles do very often.
Yeah.
Also, we live in a world full of mammals.
Yes.
Who are extremely good at eating plants. So it could also be another one of those situations where there's enough competition that it isn't worth the evolutionary path to get there.
And like, this is not unheard of in other groups. Sharks are one of those where there's a couple examples of them taking plant material, but really only the two I've ever heard of, which is the bonnet head and whale sharks taking algae. So being a group that is mostly carnivorous is not that weird, and makes sense that because eating other animals is a easier route to getting your energy and nutrition.
Right. Well, and I also, when I was saying describing reptiles not being herbivorous, I was in the Mesozoic. There were tons of herbivorous reptiles.
Yes,
there were lots of dinosaurs. There were croc cousins, but since then there hasn't really been much, and I do wonder how much of it is the fact that the world is full of birds and mammals who are just doing it better than reptiles, at least modern reptile groups, have ever managed to do.
Yes.
So not unheard of, does happen, not very common.
Yeah.
Give us a shorter, quicker patron question.
Happily, Tim asks, why did snakes never make it to Ireland? Is it just chance?
Great question. Yes, Ireland famously does not have native snake species. This is not because they were all run out of the country by an intrepid Irishman. Snakes, in the history of human occupation of the area, have not lived in Ireland. And the reason, so Ireland is an island, which means that in order to get there, you have to either take a trip across the ocean or wait for some land connection. But during the late Pleistocene, Ireland was mostly icy. It is far to the north. This was a very glaciated region. Only in the last 10,000 years or so has Ireland been receiving species more from mainland Europe. And it seems like snakes just never had the right combination of climate conditions and an available passageway to get to the island to allow them to get there and establish native populations. I don't think there are lizards native to Ireland either.
Makes sense.
They just haven't had a lot of time to get there, and the conditions have not been right for them to be able to make that trip. Ireland's not alone in this, right? Iceland doesn't have snakes. Greenland doesn't have snakes. New Zealand doesn't have snakes.
Oh, weird. I didn't know
New Zealand is snake free. It's the worst thing about New Zealand.
Yeah, that is a big mark against you.
It's a real downside. And these are places where these are islands that either there's just never been a good available passage to get there, and or the conditions have never been right for snakes to use whatever passage might have been there.
Well, and it's for many of these that it makes sense that the scenario could simply just be, simply be that, yeah, islands are hard to get to, so it's a act of chance whether or not snakes can populate even good tropical islands. Like they have many times, but you still need the odds to roll in your favor for you to get to that island.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're also an island that is a difficult, not even impossible climate for snakes, because we have cold weather snakes, garter snakes and stuff like that,
Sure.
that live in cold places. But if it's both, then it's like you need to be a snake that can handle that weather and lucky enough to have been able to get to that island.
And in the last 10,000 years, it just doesn't seem to have happened for snakes.
Yeah.
Also, snakes, I don't think of snakes as being super good at dispersing across water.
Mm-hmm.
There are cases where they have. I can't imagine snakes doing a good job dispersing across northern waters.
No.
Like I can't imagine a snake being happy to take a trip across the channel to Ireland. Like that I don't think is a particularly viable path.
Yeah.
So they might need a land connection, and those
Yes.
have also just been rare in the time that they've had to do it.
And if they were to cross over something like that, it may be one of those where, yeah, but because this is northerly or southerly enough, you could only do it during the peak of summer. That's the only time you'd be able to make this trip. So your window for making this trip is very small.
And then you have to survive.
Yes.
In the place that you just got to. So
yes.
Yeah, it is entirely possible snakes have like individually made it to Ireland
mm-hmm.
in the last 10,000 years, but then just didn't survive and never established a population there.
Yeah.
So Ireland's just it's just there hasn't been a lot of time, and there hasn't been the right opportunity for snakes to get there. So, hey, keep driving those Hummers around the block and keep doing crypto, I guess.
Yeah,
and maybe we'll
using AI.
Keep using AI. Yeah, keep using AI, and we will get some snakes to Ireland.
Yeah, we'll get them up into Alaska eventually.
Greenland or bust. Thank you to Tim and Maui for submitting those questions. Those were very fun, very fitting Snake Month questions. Thank you, everybody, for listening. If you'd like to learn more, check out the blog post that will be put up on our website with pictures and links for more information. There'll be some of the words that we've used will probably be in there. You'll get to see pictures of fantastic, adorable legless lizards. One of the things that all legless lizards do share with snakes is that they all look awesome. Yeah. Legless lizards look so cool. The wormy ones look like worms, but some snakes do that. But like glass lizards look so cool. The pygopods look they're so weird and they're so great. Go check out pictures on the blog.
Aren't the pygopods also the ones that have the hinged skulls for grabbing onto stuff?
Yeah, and they're like pointy skulls because they have like gecko faces.
Yes.
So yeah, they're so cool. Thank you to everybody for listening. Thank you to the people who've submitted requests that fueled this episode. Thank you to all of our patrons for allowing us to continue this nonsense to fortnight after fortnight. And extra big thanks to our top tier patrons, Sarah May, Danielle Loves Bugs, Jeff Ellington, and Bugs All the Way Down. Don't forget that it's Snake Month. The Snake Stuff channel is open on Discord. We're going to be doing a Snake Month live stream on July 16th, which is probably after this episode comes out. And the Snakes and Crocs tier is available on Patreon. Join and get Snake Month stickers and also contribute to charitable donations that we're going to be making to conservation efforts for crocs and snakes and other wildlife. It's a whole lot of good stuff. Stay tuned, because after July is over, we'll be able to share the results of our donation efforts, and also we'll have information about DragonCon, which is coming up soon. So stay tuned for upcoming cool stuff. We release episodes every fortnight. this is the snakes one, so we won't have a snakes episode for a little bit. But in fact, I already know what the next episode is, and it is extremely unsnaky. So
Yes,
that's
yep.
but that's okay. That's okay. I like to think that so many of our episodes are either tangentially related to snakes or things that feed snakes. The next episode certainly qualifies as one of those.
Yes.
All right, bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.